Thanks so much, John, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Ed for so beautifully introducing the kind of concepts that I'm about to be talking about. Ed spoke a lot about amplifiers and the need for open data to be more than just a spreadsheet on the internet, for it to have the kind of services built around it that mean that users can actually get something out of all the data that's being put up there. And that's something that I'm going to talk a little bit about. Something I've been thinking about a lot in some of the work that we've been doing at the Open Data Institute around the world is a new way of thinking about public-private partnerships, that in order for any open data program to be really meaningful, it has to be a public-private partnership. It absolutely depends on public and private actors both working together to solve really interesting problems and approaching data not just as something nerdy and fun that we like to talk about in rooms like this, but as a way to solve real problems. In opening that up, something I sometimes like to ask in rooms like this is, who here liked maths at school? I did. So what I just saw is about 2/3 of the room put up their hand, and what I sometimes like to remind people is that if this was a normal room, whatever a normal room would be, the numbers would probably be a little bit smaller. So I think when we think about data and when we talk about data, I sometimes try and remind myself that even the word data can be incredibly off-putting to a lot of people because it implies something they don't understand, something that was confusing to them in high school, in primary school, and something that continues to be used sometimes as a way to obfuscate the truth or to make things more confusing to them. So today I'm going to be focused on one particular program. It's a program that I've been working on with a number of really terrific teams in Mexico City. It's only one example of an amplification technique, but it's something that goes a little bit beyond the technical solutions to amplifying open data and goes into relationship building and trust and things that I find really interesting. I'm not a techie myself. My background is in government, and so what excites me most about open data is how it can make governments more effective and solve really interesting social and economic problems. At the Open Data Institute, Ed also referenced us earlier, thank you. We connect, equip and inspire people around the world to innovate with data. So what that means in terms of my job is I spend a lot of time traveling, as does my team, and we do a lot of capacity building work around the world in developing countries, in emerging economies, and also in developed countries, including working across Europe. And I'm delighted that the ODAN project, which we are also a partner on, will be spoken about shortly. One of the reasons why the Open Data Institute was set up in the UK was to answer the so what question about open data. The UK was one of the first countries in the world to get really serious about investing in its open data, both in terms of time, in terms of political capital and some risk-taking, and also in terms of financial resources. And there was a lot of impatience in those early days. I think there's still a lot of impatience in demonstrating that the value was worth the investment. So part of the purpose of ODI is to help find those stories, in some cases to help create the stories ourselves, and to talk about them and explain why it is that open data is better than closed data and why the potential is so exciting. So one of the pieces of work that we've done over the past year or so is survey a number of open data businesses across the UK, because one of the things that we wanted to prove is that open data is not just about government and it's not just about improving effectiveness in government, but rather it's a really valuable resource that's already being used by businesses all over the world, but in this case our focus was in the UK where we're headquartered. We found 270 open data companies in the UK. And by open data companies, I don't just mean the companies that are building open data portals, although we of course included those. I mean the companies that are using open data every day as part of their business. And a lot of these companies aren't cool new tech startups. They are your run-of-the-mill everyday businesses who are using open data to do things like deliver their packages more effectively, or to better target their advertising through the use of demographic data. And so it's terrific too that in Barbara's and Hervé's speeches earlier today, there was such a focus on geospatial data and the possibilities of this kind of data, because this remains the most useful, the most important, the most used form of open data by businesses around the UK, as well as things like transport data, environmental data, demographics, and corporate data. So being able to look up companies and see where they're based, who their directors are, and so on. In the early days of the data revolution, there were a lot of analogies thrown around about data being the new oil or the new gold. And this is something that we've fought against pretty hard, because the big difference between data and, say, oil is that oil is not renewable. So the more you use oil, the less useful it becomes. The more you use data, the more useful it becomes. It is a completely different kind of resource. And indeed, we would argue that it's not just a resource in the traditional sense, it's actually a form of infrastructure. So we talk a lot about data being the new roads. Just as roads help you navigate towards a destination, data helps you navigate towards a decision. And just as we've just heard the analogy about Albanian jazz compared with Beyonce or Taylor Swift or whoever else, some of the roads of data or open data need to be superhighways. They need to be incredibly easy to access for everyone. These are the roads where it is most important that they be open, that all the metadata be available. Perhaps these are the roads that need to be 5-star. And then there are some roads that are a little bit less important, or at least that not so many people will use. So it's still great that they be open, but they don't necessarily need to be serviced to the same extent. The important thing is, though, that people know that those roads exist, and this is where some open data policies break down. This is a picture of Mexico City, which is the largest city in the Americas. It's about 21 million people in the larger metropolitan area. And with that comes all the kinds of problems that you might expect from a fast-growing and exciting metropolis. There are terrible traffic problems. I can say this having spent 3 weeks there in the past year and an awful lot of hours in taxis. There are problems with air pollution. There are problems with inequality. Transportation, whether due to traffic or due to lack of public transportation, is a mess. A lot of it is informal and therefore really hard to track. There are problems of disease, and there are problems of trying to manage rapid growth. It is the kind of place that is absolutely ready for an open data solution. And partly for this reason, there is a terrific team working in the President's office in Mexico who over the past 2.5 years or so have embarked on one of the more ambitious open data programs that we've worked with at ODI around the world. They were so ambitious that instead of, for example, implementing a policy and waiting for other people to open up their data around government, they knew that what they needed instead was champions and Mexican stories. So in an attempt to build that really quickly, they created a team called the Data Squads. It was a small team of experts. So, for example, as well as having technical experts, they also had legal experts, they had communications assistants, they had people who were good at all the kinds of things that can get in the way when a government or when a ministry first starts to open its data. And so they would go in and effectively do a crash course in open data in this ministry. They'd help them identify the most valuable data sets, and they'd have a whole bunch of data sets up online within 2 weeks. And as a result, Mexico opened its first 100 data sets in only 42 days, which is pretty extraordinary for any of you who've worked on a government open data strategy, especially starting from scratch as they did 2 years ago in 2014. The problem was that although they had opened over the past couple of years huge numbers of open data sets and prioritising especially the ones that they knew from the research were going to be the most used and the most useful, the number of applications of open data remained quite small in Mexico. And this being the kind of team that genuinely wants to learn from its mistakes and get better, they invited in the OECD about 4 or 5 months ago, which did a study of Mexico's open data initiative. And as you might expect, they praised the team for their ambition and also for their rapid progress. But they also said, open data has yet to make a sustainable domestic impact on the Mexican economy and society. And for a terrific hard-working team that's been pouring money and time into this for 2.5 years, that was very disappointing. And they wanted to work out very quickly how to turn what they had been doing, which is publishing data sets online, into something that was actually going to create the kind of economic and social impact that was really driving them. So they brought together a really interesting team. I say it's interesting because as far as I can tell, it's the only startup accelerator that operates on a model quite like this one that we found in the world. They invited us at ODI, international experts who also have a number of different interests in open data startups around the world, to join with them to design a program. But critically, they also brought in a really terrific local partner. They're an organisation called Demos, and they bring together experts in civic tech with coders who work part-time at places like Google and Facebook. So they have a combination of skills in social entrepreneurship and skills in technology. And they also have something that government does not. They have connections to the community, and they have a really strong level of trust. Trust in government in Mexico is terrible, and in large part that's for completely understandable reasons. But when it comes to this team, who are doing what they're doing to try and make government better, this is a constant frustration for them. So this is why for them it's been so important to design for trust, and this is where parts of the public-private partnership come into play. I think that if government were running this incubator by themselves, they would not have been able to generate the kind of publicity or interest or the high quality of startups that we now have a couple of months later in the program. I'll tell you about those in a minute or two. So by adding an international partner with a bit of a name and a local partner that really understands the community and can do a lot of day-to-day work, they create something that's really valuable. And yet for us and for Demos, the organisation that is helping to run things on the ground in Mexico, the role of government remains absolutely crucial. And this is where the public part of the public-private partnership comes in, because a lot of the startups that are part of this program have really interesting data needs that government might not have heard about before, or that they might not have known about before this program. And one of the things that government has been doing with the support of the startups themselves is making the case directly to ministries who hold certain data. So, for example, one of the things we learned while we were in Mexico is that there is already a GPS tracker in most of the buses in Mexico City. That data goes straight to the Ministry of Transport. It is not then opened. So there are certain opportunities like that that are so simple and that are almost as easy as flicking a switch, or at least changing the legal requirements and expectations about how data can be used, and yet they haven't been done. And that's partly because when you go into a country like Mexico or other countries we work with around the world, we have programs in Tanzania and in Ukraine, for example, it's not enough to give them the story of Citymapper or to talk to them about the impact of opening up transport data in London. What they want is local examples and local meaning. And so part of why we chose to focus our efforts on the open data policy, not on publication of data, but on use of data, and specifically use of data by startups, is because we felt this was a way to create the kind of local inspiring examples that would really make a difference for government and that puts a face to a policy question. Our other major insight was to start with the problem, not start with the data. So in about June, we issued an open call to startups from around Mexico, not just Mexico City, but from the whole country. And we invited them to apply for this program. What this program gives them is a combination of mentoring, training and support, access to investors and also some office space. We're not taking any equity, and it's not a very well-funded program. Instead, what people are getting is a combination of capacity building, a little bit of office space and practical support like that, and also opportunities to get access to government and to policymakers who might control the kind of data or information that's really meaningful to them. But instead of asking for open data businesses, we asked a US startup solving an economic or a social problem in Mexico who could build a better product or service or insight using government open data. We were not sure, starting from scratch and with not much time to bring together the group of people we needed, whether we'd have many applications, and I think we were hoping for 15. In 3 weeks we received over 60, and the quality was really high. And one of the terrific things about getting these applications is that we asked everyone to list what government open data would you most like to see opened. And so we ended up being able to give the government a list that they hadn't seen before, which was not just what's being used and not just people who might bother to write into the portal, but a different group of users, a group of entrepreneurs who are already building companies asking for particular data sets. And amazingly, what the government found is that 60% of the data that was requested was already open. And this was a really important moment for government in realising that so many of their efforts cajoling government departments and spending months training people up across government to be able to open data sets to understand what that's all about was still leading to data sets that were up there but that weren't being used. This goes back to the "no man is an island" quote that we also had earlier, that to have a piece of information online that people don't know about is a terrible waste of time and money, but also a terrible waste of opportunity and potential. So one of the first things that the government has done as a result is put a lot more energy into its communications campaign so that people understand what data is available. Of the data requested, as I said, 60% was already open. 5% they were able to open within a week. It was data that they had that they didn't know people wanted. And they are aiming to have 90% of the data sets requested open by the end of November, which is also the end of the pilot program. Up here we have 8 of the startups that we chose to be part of the pilot program. With a number of colleagues and also with the team in government and the team at Demos, I spent the most wonderful week interviewing 21 Mexican startups, regretting that my Spanish was not better, and learning about all the different ways that they were solving or trying to solve social and economic problems around Mexico. We had startups that were focused on mental health, startups focused on sustainable fishing, on green spaces, on traffic, on parking, on illegal immigration, on civic participation, all kinds of things, and many of them were applications of open data that the government had not imagined and that we at ODI, doing this all the time as a day job, had not heard of before. My favourite story is about one of the startups that's listed up there called Yana, which was one of the 8 that we chose for the program. You're not meant to have a favourite startup, I think, but I do, so don't tell the others. The young woman we interviewed for Yana is in her early 20s. She's very impressive, and her co-founder is even younger. He's still at high school. And I asked her, "What's your great idea?" And she told me that around the world, and especially in emerging markets and developing countries, the time it takes for a person to first think that they might have depression until they get medical care, formal medical care and support, is about 10 years. And she said, "For people who use the app I'm going to build, I want it to be 1 month." I thought, that's vision, I like that. And I asked her how she wanted to do it, and she basically has a plan in which people with self-identified depression get the kind of extraordinary, semi-personalised, semi-automated care and attention that would be really, really difficult to provide, especially to someone who hasn't yet admitted to the rest of the world or isn't yet comfortable talking about the fact that they have depression. And she's working with a number of psychologists, both in Mexico and around the world, to talk about what are the kind of simple interventions that a mobile phone app can remind someone to do that can make a big difference to them feeling able to seek help. This was all really interesting to me, and I asked her about competitors. And she said, "There are lots of competitors. I have downloaded every one. I have tried them. None of them are good enough," which I also really respect it. So she's building something amazing, I think. And it's hard work because, for example, as you might imagine, there's all kinds of legal quandaries about the use of data and also about the risks that they have in taking on some kind of care for people with a serious condition. And The nice thing is that the kinds of group of people who are helping her through that are not only people who have data expertise, and we have data experts helping her from the UK over grainy Skype calls. She also has a terrific group of startup mentors in Mexico, and she also has access to government so that they can help her directly with the kind of legislative change that might be required in order to make a service like this possible. But what about the open data angle? It took me a little while to work it out, and I asked her directly, but why is open data useful? Why do you want to be part of this program? And she explained to me that she wants to be able to help people find things in their area that can be useful to them. So in the early stage, that might be things like a gym or a local park or a running group or something like that. But when later on in the program, she also wants to be able to point them to which local services can offer, for example, mental health care. And she explained that there, as far as she knew, was no central repository of that kind of data in Mexico. So what she needed was not transport information to build a really techie app. What she needed was to be able to direct people to their nearest GP who's qualified in mental health, or the nearest hospital that provides a mental health service. This is the team based in Mexico. Sadly, this was one of the weeks I didn't get to go to because I can't spend my whole life in Mexico City. But what it shows is just a really nice variety of people. You can't tell there who's working in government, who's working in an NGO, and who's working in a startup. I only know that because I know them. And to me, that's what a public-private partnership should look like. And one of the really nice things about this program is that it's part funded by the government of Mexico, and they are funding the part that they are directly involved in and helping with space and so on. And it is part funded by the UK Embassy in Mexico. And they are funding the contribution of ODI and also of Demos, which makes us equal partners in a way that I think is quite unusual. So when you think about a traditional public-private partnership, the tunnel that's fraught with difficulties and that's becoming too expensive, there's a really tricky power relationship. Whereas in an open data public-private partnership, that needn't exist because there's often such a win-win for both sides. And the way that money or time or resource transfers is very different because people are often trying to solve the same problem. So because we believe in this so much as a way of helping to solve social and economic problems and also answering the open data so what question, also as a way of seeing where open data is going next and how it can be most interesting and useful for businesses, we are starting to grow what we're increasingly seeing as a global network of open data startup accelerators. So this started with the ODI's own startup incubator in the UK, which we still run, and which is our most intensive and hands-on of our open data incubators. We've also been involved in the ODINE project across Europe, which we'll be hearing about shortly, and which is something where we've learnt a huge amount, especially when it comes to things like how to do effective remote mentoring, to have a remote network of people, which is something that's very challenging, but which we keep working on and which we find really worthwhile. The third of these was the Labora project in Mexico, which actually only launched in August. The startups have been involved in it for 2 months, and there's 2 months more to run in that program. And then we will also be launching in December a startup accelerator that we are running with the government of Malaysia. It is based in Kuala Lumpur, but it's going to be inviting data-driven startups from across Southeast Asia. And what we really hope is that we can maximise opportunities for these startups to learn from one another, because there are a few things that are quite different about open data businesses. One is that they have quite a unique relationship with government. They're incredibly dependent because for a lot of them they are building their business model on free data that's being released by government. They need to make sure that that continues. Secondly, it's tricky because for open data startups that are part of traditional startup incubators, it's often quite confusing to the other startups there how you can build something on the basis of something free. And a lot of open data startups too are sharing a lot of what they're doing for free as well. So it's a very different kind of business model. But the other opportunity we see in sharing these kinds of success stories internationally is the possibilities for scaling. So for example, in a lot of the interviews that we had in Mexico City, several of the startups said that if they can make this work in Mexico City, they can make it work in any city in the world because they were quite convinced that Mexico City was the most complex, the most difficult transport system anywhere. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I certainly see real possibility for scaling. And this is also where, for example, things that sound really technical like data standards and metadata become so important, because only with a commonly applicable set of data standards can a business that's working in Mexico City be transplanted somewhere like Shanghai, for example. And I think these kinds of opportunities are so vital that we should take advantage of them wherever we can. So finally, returning to the theme of public-private partnerships, I think open data programs can give civil servants a really interesting new role, which is that they become their own actor, a little bit more independent than they might be otherwise, an actor within government that is advocating not against government, certainly for government and for government policy outcomes, but advocating for people outside government that hopefully they have met and that they know. This is why we think it's so important that open data innovation not be a hypothetical user, but be a real user with a real problem, and one that often we might not have imagined or come up with. And it's these civil servants that can be advocating not just to release data, but perhaps they've spotted a quirk of the law that makes things really tricky. And they're the ones who are in a position to change it. And it's the kind of relationship that's not necessarily easy, and they're communities that don't necessarily talk to each other very much. But we are trying to build different kinds of ways to make that relationship work better. So this is the kind of thing too that we hope will start to create the kind of impact that is possible with open data, and the kind of amplifier that I think will make an enormous difference in making sure that the efforts of the past 5 or 6 years have the benefits that everyone is hoping for. Thank you.